My husband slapped our own son just because Matthew asked for a simple birthday cake. I thought that would be the most painful wound of my entire life. But the very next day, right before my eyes, my husband gifted a luxurious iPad to his nephew with a smile of pure pride. It was then that my father arrived and saw the red mark of the slap on his grandson's cheek. I had never seen my father so angry. In front of everyone, he uttered a single sentence that made my husband laugh with sheer contempt. No one could have ever imagined that this one sentence would be the beginning of the absolute destruction of my husband's entire life. Before we get to the core of today's story, for those of you who have already subscribed and hit the like button, I wish you great health and hope life showers you with abundance. Comment down below which state or city in the US you're watching us from. I hope you find this video helpful, and that we can all take away a valuable lesson. Please watch until the end. My name is Sarah. If anyone were to ask me when my life began to change, the answer wouldn't be when I got divorced, nor when my husband filed for bankruptcy, not even when he was left without a single dollar to his name. Everything started with a slap that landed across the cheek of my own son. That day, Matthew was turning 7 years old. From the moment he woke up, his face was lit up with a bright smile. He hugged me several times, asking if he would really get to blow out birthday candles that night, just like his classmates at elementary school did. I just smiled and nodded my head. Deep down, however, I was agonizing over how to make that simple wish come true. I wasn't a rich mother. Ever since I married David, he had single-handedly controlled all of our income. He only gave me just enough cash for groceries at the supermarket, strictly limiting even what I could buy for Matthew's basic needs. I often had to scrape together my daily budget, penny by penny. For almost 3 weeks, I had been secretly taking in small clothing alteration and sewing jobs from the neighbors in our subdivision. At night, after Matthew went to sleep, I would sit and sew until my eyes stung. The pay wasn't much, but it was just enough to buy a small birthday cake from the local bakery. It wasn't a tiered cake or anything expensive, just a simple cake with 7 candles. I just wanted to see Matthew smile. That was all. That morning, while I was counting the few dollar bills and quarters I had earned from sewing, David suddenly walked into the bedroom. "What is that?" he asked. Instinctively, I covered the money with my hand. "Nothing." David grabbed my arm roughly. "A few dollar bills slipped into plain sight. Why are you hiding that?" I tried to smile. "Today is Matthew's birthday. I want to buy him a small cake." I hadn't even finished speaking when David's expression changed completely. Without a word, he snatched all the money right out of my hand. As a reflex, I tried to stop him. "I earned that money sewing, and it's for Matthew." David shoved the bills into his leather wallet. "You spoil the kid too much." "But he only wants—" I couldn't finish before David cut me off. Having a birthday doesn't make anyone special. Besides, blowing out candles is a waste of money. I could only lower my head, not out of fear, but because I didn't want Matthew to hear us fighting. As he walked out of the room, David still found the time to add, "Don't ever teach the boy to ask for stupid things." I closed my eyes. The weight crushing my chest wasn't about the money he had taken, but the heartbreaking reality that my own husband had never once tried to understand his son's feelings. By mid-afternoon, the house started filling up with people. My mother-in-law, Barbara, arrived along with my sister-in-law and her family for our typical Sunday cookout. It was a tradition for them to gather at our suburban McMansion on the weekends, but oddly enough, every time they came over, David's attention was always entirely focused on his nephew, Hunter. The boy was barely 11 years old, yet almost anything he asked for was handed to him on a silver platter. Sometimes it was a pair of expensive Air Jordans, other times an Apple Watch, or a pricey new video game. Meanwhile, Matthew was always told to yield. If they fought over a toy, Matthew was the one forced to apologize. If there was one last piece of food, Matthew had to share it. If there were gifts, Matthew was always the last to get anything. At first, I thought it was all in my head, but over time, the blatant favoritism became undeniable. That afternoon, everyone was eating together in the family room. My mother-in-law praised her grandson Hunter several times because he had just made the honor roll at his middle school. David smiled with beaming pride. "It's only right that your uncle gives you a reward," he said. Everyone laughed. In a corner of the room, Matthew sat quietly, playing with a plastic spoon. Every now and then, he would look over at me. His eyes seemed to ask, "Mommy, where is my cake?" I felt my heart being wrung out like a wet towel. All I could do was gently stroke his hair. "Forgive me, sweetie. Mommy couldn't make your wish come true today." A few minutes later, while everyone was still chatting around the coffee table, Matthew slowly stood up. He walked over to his father. His tiny hands gripped the hem of his own t-shirt out of sheer nervousness. His voice came out as a tiny whisper. "Dad." David was glued to the screen of his iPhone. "What is it, Matt?" Matthew took a deep breath. Can I ask for a small birthday cake?" The room fell into a dead silence. All eyes locked onto Matthew. I saw a faint smile form on my son's face. Maybe he thought his father would soften. Maybe he believed that every kid has the right to ask for a present on their birthday. But the very next second, smack. The sound of a heavy slap shattered the silence. Matthew's little body was thrown backward until he hit the hardwood floor. His hand was still clutching the plastic spoon, which went skittering under the table. "Mommy." His voice was a choked, breathless whisper. I immediately ran to scoop him into my arms. His left cheek was bright red. Tears streamed down his face without a sound. Trembling all over, I turned to David. "David!" He just asked for a cake. Instead of calming down, David stood up and pointed a finger right in Matthew's face. If he's taught to beg from a young age, he'll grow up to be a spoiled, useless brat. My mother-in-law, Barbara, nodded in smug agreement. "Good for you, David. Children need to be raised with a firm hand." My sister-in-law let out a soft chuckle. I looked at their faces one by one. Not a single person stepped forward to check on Matthew. Nobody asked if his cheek hurt. Nobody thought that violent slap was an overreaction. All they did was validate David. I hugged Matthew tighter against my chest, but I couldn't have imagined that the very next day, David would do something to deepen the wound in my son's heart 1,000 times over. That night, Matthew went to sleep without saying a single word. He didn't even cry anymore. That was exactly what terrified me the most. Normally, after a crying fit, he would come hug me and tell me whatever was on his mind. But this time, he just hugged his favorite stuffed animal and closed his eyes much faster than usual. Right before drifting off completely, his little lips whispered, "Mommy, tomorrow I won't ask for anything else." I held my tears so they wouldn't fall. That sentence echoed in my head until morning. The next day, the house was filled with noise again. It turned out my mother-in-law had come over specifically because my nephew was dropping by after school. According to her, David had prepared a little surprise for him. I had absolutely zero interest in knowing what it was. My thoughts were entirely focused on Matthew, who had been dead silent since he woke up. Normally, he'd run out to the backyard to play with his Hot Wheels. Not today. He sat alone on the porch, drawing something in an old notebook. I walked up to him. "What are you drawing, buddy?" Matthew snapped the notebook shut. "Nothing, Mom." I forced a smile. "If you don't want to show me, that's okay." Eventually, he slowly flipped the page open. He had drawn a little boy standing in front of a birthday cake with 7 candles. Next to him was a mother. There was no father figure drawn. My chest tightened again. I rubbed his back, entirely unable to speak. Around noon, the honk of a car echoed in the driveway. David had just come home from the office, but this time, his face looked far more cheerful than usual. In his hand, he carried a crisp white bag with that unmistakable bitten apple logo that everyone recognizes. My nephew immediately ran up to him. "Uncle Dave, who is that for?" David grinned from ear to ear. "You'll see right now." Everyone gathered in the foyer. I stayed standing in the back, holding Matthew by the hand. A tiny sliver of hope sparked in my heart. Maybe David felt guilty. Maybe this gift was actually for Matthew. Maybe last night he just let his anger get the best of him. I squeezed Matthew's hand a little tighter. I saw my son's eyes begin to sparkle. He stared unblinking at the white bag. His hand absent-mindedly gripped the bottom of my shirt. David pulled a sleek, flat box out of the bag. It was still wrapped in its original plastic. My mother-in-law gasped in admiration. "Oh my goodness, that is incredibly expensive." My nephew started jumping for joy, though he still didn't dare grab it. Maybe he too thought the gift wasn't for him. David stood there, smiling with sheer satisfaction. Then, he handed the box over. "For you." My nephew's eyes went wide. "Seriously, Uncle Dave?" "Yep, for getting such great grades and making the honor roll." The foyer erupted in applause. My mother-in-law hugged her grandson, praising David as the most thoughtful uncle in all of Texas. Everyone was smiling happily, everyone, except for one little boy standing right next to me. Slowly, Matthew let go of my hand. His gaze was no longer glued to the iPad. He was staring at the floor. His face was entirely void of expression. He wasn't angry. He wasn't crying. He was just silent. A silence that hurt so much more. I knelt down in front of him. Matthew. He instantly forced a tiny smile. That's so cool, Mom. I hope Hunter likes it. I barely had the strength to smile back. A boy so young still found it in him to wish for someone else's happiness, even while his own heart was breaking into pieces. Shortly after, my nephew started setting up his new iPad. Everyone crowded around him on the living room sofa. They laughed as the screen lit up, busy praising the camera's technology. No one noticed that Matthew was slowly walking out to the backyard. I followed him. I saw him sit on the back porch steps, playing with a single birthday candle I had stashed in my apron pocket the night before. I had actually bought that candle long before David confiscated my money. The wick had never been lit. Matthew rolled it softly between his little fingers. Mommy? Tell me, sweetie. If next year... He paused for a moment. If I don't celebrate my birthday, it's okay, Mommy. That sentence finally made my tears spill over. I pulled him into a fierce hug. Don't say that. Why? Because the day you were born was the happiest day of Mommy's entire life. Matthew offered a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. A few minutes later, the sound of an SUV pulling up to the front gate caught our attention. I wiped my tears away as fast as I could. A man in his 60s stepped out of the vehicle carrying a rather large gift box. It was my father, Robert. A few days prior, he had called to tell me he wanted to surprise Matthew for his birthday. Because he'd been caught up with business out of state, he hadn't been able to make it until this afternoon. As soon as he recognized his grandpa's car, Matthew jumped to his feet. His face, which had been gloomy since dawn, finally lit up just a bit. Grandpa! He ran toward him, but suddenly, his footsteps slowed. My father stopped a few feet away from Matthew. His gaze locked instantly onto his grandson's left cheek. There was still a reddish, bruised mark that hadn't entirely faded. My father's expression shifted. His warm smile vanished instantly. He set the large gift box down on the hood of the SUV without taking his eyes off Matthew's face. With a very soft voice, my father asked, Matthew, what happened to your face? Instinctively, Matthew lowered his head, and his hands started fiddling with his shirt hem. He didn't answer. I could see my father's breathing grow heavier. He slowly turned his head toward the large living room window. Inside, David was still laughing with his family while watching his nephew play with the brand new iPad. My father's gaze shifted from David's face to the iPad in the nephew's hands, and then back to the mark of the slap on Matthew's cheek. I had known my father my whole life. He was not a man prone to quick anger, but for the first time ever, I saw the gleam in his eyes turn absolutely ice cold. And when he started walking toward the front door, I knew something massive was about to go down. My father walked in unhurried. The atmosphere in the living room, which had been full of laughter seconds before, gradually grew incredibly awkward. No one knew why he had walked in looking so furious. I followed right behind him, holding Matthew's hand. I don't know why, but I felt that something I had been suppressing for years was finally going to explode today. My father stopped right in front of the coffee table. He didn't look directly at David. Instead, he stared at the iPad still in Hunter's hands. Then, he slowly lifted his head. David. His voice sounded completely calm, but it was exactly that eerie calmness that plunged the entire room into absolute silence. David glanced up at him. Well, look who it is. Robert, you're here. There was no warm greeting, no respect. He went back to paying attention to his nephew, as if my father's arrival was completely insignificant. My father took a deep breath. Put that device down for a second. Everyone exchanged confused glances. The nephew looked bewildered and eventually handed the iPad over to David. My father then asked in a low voice, Who bought that? I did. For who? For my nephew? My father nodded slowly. And my grandson? David shrugged indifferently. What about Matt? He is your son too. He has a heart too. My father's tone began to shift, and I saw him look David dead in the eye. The one you choose to make happy is someone else's kid. David smirked with arrogant disdain. Don't push my buttons, Robert. He deserved this gift. My father asked again. Then what does Matthew deserve? The room fell silent again. No one dared to answer. A few seconds later, David said in a flat tone, A lesson. I clenched my fists. My father was still trying to contain his rage. What kind of lesson? So he learns that life isn't just about demanding whatever whim pops into his head. Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law nodded in immediate approval. Exactly. Kids these days are way too spoiled. We are very proud that David has the guts to discipline his son firmly. My father slowly turned his head toward my mother-in-law. I am not speaking to you, ma'am. That single sentence shut her up instantly. For the first time, no one dared to interrupt my dad. He turned back to David. I just want one answer. Do you regret it or not? David didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back into the leather sofa and crossed his arms. I don't feel like I did anything wrong. My chest felt tight. I knew my father had just given him an out, a chance, but that chance had just been thrown right into the garbage. My father lowered his head for a few seconds and then bang! He slammed his palm against the glass coffee table with so much force that the coffee mugs violently rattled. My nephew even ran to hug his grandmother out of pure shock. I didn't come here to listen to your excuses. My father's voice was booming now. I came to check on exactly one thing. Do you still have a shred of a heart left, or have you lost it completely to your own arrogance? David stood up, getting defensive. Look, don't exaggerate. I am Matthew's father. I have the right to raise my son however the hell I please. My father took a step toward him. It's true, you are his father. But since when does being a father mean you have the right to trample on your own son's dignity? David was losing his patience. If you don't like how I raise my kid, that's your problem. This is my house, my family, and I don't need any outsiders coming in here giving me orders. Those words poured gasoline on the fire. My mother-in-law scrambled to her feet. David is right. In-laws have no business meddling in their children's marriages. I looked at my mother-in-law in absolute disbelief. Even after seeing everything that happened, she was still choosing to blindly defend her son. My father let out a faint smile, but there wasn't a drop of warmth in it. I am not meddling, he said, pointing back at Matthew, who was still hiding behind me. I am defending my grandson. Silence suffocated the room. Then, my father stared at David unblinking. Listen to me very carefully. From this exact moment forward, do not ever refer to me as your father-in-law or your family, ever again. Everyone's eyes went wide. David looked taken aback for a second, but it only lasted a moment. Then he let out a scoffing laugh. All this drama over some nonsense. Nonsense. My father's tone turned glacial. To you, it might be nonsense. But to a little boy, a slap from his own father can be a wound he drags with him for the rest of his life. Nobody spoke. Even the sound of people breathing could be heard clearly. David spoke again, dripping with defiance. So what are you gonna do? You gonna sue me? Expose me? You gonna ruin my life? My father gently shook his head. No. Then he looked him dead in the eye. I am just going to take back what, all this time, was never really yours to begin with. That sentence made everyone exchange confused looks. My mother-in-law frowned. My sister-in-law looked completely lost. Even I didn't understand what my father was referring to. Only David still looked relaxed. He even gave a mocking smile. Are you threatening me? Is that a warning? David laughed even harder. What exactly are you going to take from me? This house is in my name. My sports cars are paid off. My real estate development company is expanding rapidly. I built all of this by myself. My father didn't argue with him. He just stared at David for a long moment. It was a strange look. It wasn't a look of rage, but the look of a man who had just finalized a massive decision. He then picked up the gift box he had left near the front door. Before walking out, my dad stopped for a split second. Without looking back, he said in a low voice, David, you are very proud of everything you have today. Hold on to it tightly. Because starting tomorrow morning, you are going to lose every last bit of it. He walked out. The heavy front door clicked shut. Shortly after, the sound of his SUV engine faded down the street. For a few seconds, silence reigned. Then, David let out a booming theatrical laugh. Your dad is a joke. Just because he's mad, he starts throwing around stupid threats. My mother-in-law smiled too. Let it go. You know how older folks get. He'll get over it. I just stared at the door my father had just walked through. I didn't know why, but I felt deep in my gut that this threat was not just an emotional outburst. I had known my dad my whole life. He never said anything without a solid reason, and for the very first time, I began to fear what would happen when the sun came up the next morning. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was dead quiet. David had already left for his corporate office downtown before the sun was even fully up. He said he had a critical meeting with investors and major developers for some multi-million-dollar high-rise projects down in Miami. I didn't think much of it. My mind was still occupied by the image of Matthew, who since yesterday spent more time silent than speaking. I made a simple breakfast and walked him to the yellow school bus stop. Before stepping onto the bus, Matthew turned to me. "Mommy? Tell me, sweetie. Later when I get back, can I give you a really long hug?" I smiled while brushing his hair back. "You can hug me for as long as you want." Matthew nodded softly and walked onto the bus. I watched him until his tiny silhouette disappeared among the other kids. Around 9:00 a.m., my cell phone rang. David's name flashed on the screen. I picked up, but before I could say a word, I heard David yelling at someone on his end. "What do you mean they canceled the meeting out of nowhere?" I only heard muffled voices on the other end of the line. A few seconds later, the call dropped. I figured he lost his signal. But 15 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't David. It was Ashley, his executive assistant. "Sarah? Has Mr. David contacted you?" "Yes, just a moment ago. If he calls back, please tell him we are desperately looking for him." "Looking for him? What's going on?" The woman's voice was trembling with panic. "Several of our biggest clients just canceled their meetings for today. Out of nowhere. All at the exact same time." "All of them?" "Yes, Sarah." I started to realize something highly unusual was happening. In all my years married to David, I had never heard of multiple major clients canceling their agendas on the exact same day. By noon, I received another call, this time from David. The moment he spoke, his voice sounded entirely different from his usual cocky tone. It was higher, faster, like someone frantically trying to suppress a panic attack. "Sarah, did your father contact you?" I stayed quiet for a second. "No. Are you sure?" David let out a long, shaky exhale. "Forget it," and he hung up again. I was getting more and more confused. It was the first time David had mentioned my father since yesterday's blowout. By mid-afternoon, I was just about to go pick Matthew up when my phone buzzed again. This time it was a short text. David was just asking me to come down to his office. When I arrived, the atmosphere was entirely off. Normally, the corporate lobby was bustling with clients and employees coming and going. Today, it looked like a ghost town. A few employees were huddled up whispering. As soon as they saw me walk in, they fell dead silent. I walked toward David's corner office. The glass door was cracked open. Inside, David was pacing back and forth with his cell phone glued to his hand. His face was ghostly pale. "You finally made it." "What is going on?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he handed me a heavy folder full of legal documents and certified FedEx letters. I read them one by one. The first was a breach of contract notice for the construction of an industrial park. The second came from a massive residential real estate developer. The contents were practically identical. They had decided to immediately suspend all negotiations. I looked up. How could this happen? That is what I'm trying to figure out. David took a ragged breath. All of this happened in a matter of hours. Before I could reply, a knock came at the door. The chief operating officer walked in, his face tight with stress. "David, it's getting worse. The Steel Supply Corporation just contacted us. They are refusing to send any materials until there is a guaranteed proof of funds." David jumped up. "We've never had a single problem with them in years. They say the mandate came directly from their corporate headquarters." "What's their reason?" The COO shook his head. They refused to give an explanation. They hadn't even finished speaking when the office phone rang. This time, it was the accounting department. The voice coming through the speakerphone brought absolute silence to the room. "Boss, the bank just requested updated financial documentation for everything. They've frozen the disbursement of the credit line that was supposed to clear this week." David's face tightened in disbelief. "That's impossible. We meet every single requirement." Their only response was, verbatim, "There has been a change in the company's risk rating." The line clicked dead. The office was swallowed by a heavy, suffocating silence. For the very first time, I saw David truly, genuinely disoriented. He immediately started dialing several high-powered contacts who had always been buddy-buddy with him. The first didn't pick up. The second went to voicemail. The third rang, but the call was actively rejected. With every call he made, the color drained further from his face. His usual bulletproof confidence was evaporating by the second. As the sun began to set that afternoon, the chief financial officer rushed into the room carrying a dusty, old-looking black binder, like it had been sitting in the archives for years. "David, there's a document you need to see right now." David looked completely fed up. "If it's not life or death, leave it for later." The CFO shook his head. It is absolutely life or death. And why are you bringing this to me now? I just pulled it from the old contracts archive. David grabbed the binder without really looking at it, but before he could open it, his cell phone rang again. He opted to answer the call, tossing the binder onto his mahogany desk. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of the cover. In the bottom right corner, a small, typed label read, Confidential Strategic Investment Agreement. I don't know why, but from the second I saw that binder, I felt that every answer we were looking for was sitting right inside it. The office door closed again after David finished his phone call. His expression was utterly disastrous now. I had never seen him like this. Through all our years of marriage, David had always been so sure of himself. Even when facing problems, he always bragged that anything could be fixed with money and the right connections. But today was different. He was staring blankly at the wall, trying to process what the hell was happening. The CFO was still standing across the desk, pointing at the ignored black binder. David, we cannot postpone this. David let out a heavy sigh. What is in that document? The CFO slowly slid the binder across the desk. Please, read the very last page. The room went dead silent. David flipped the binder open, looking annoyed. The first few pages contained records of capital injections from years ago. He turned the page. More technical investment details. Then, he finally stopped at a page filled with signatures and corporate notary seals. I saw the light in his eyes completely alter. His forehead creased. He read it again. Then, for a third time, his hands started shaking violently. This. David's voice sounded like a weak croak. What contract is this? The CFO replied in a low voice. It is the corporate bailout agreement from 5 years ago. Even I was shocked. Bailout? The CFO turned to me. You probably never knew this, Sarah. 5 years ago, this company was on the absolute brink of filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. I looked at David. In all this time, he had never once mentioned that era to me. All I knew was that his business had gone through a rough patch. And then, a few months later, it miraculously experienced explosive, massive growth. The CFO continued explaining. At the time, every single bank denied our loan applications. Almost all our suppliers suspended their services. The company couldn't even make payroll. If an angel investor hadn't stepped in right then, this company would have been liquidated. I began to understand where this conversation was heading. And who was the investor? The CFO didn't answer directly. He just pointed at the name of the LLC printed on the final page. I read it slowly. The name of the holding company meant nothing to me. However, right beneath it was the name of the majority shareholder. When I read that name, my blood ran cold. My father, Robert. The office felt like a vacuum. David stared fixedly at that name, unblinking, as if praying he was reading it wrong. That is impossible. The CFO nodded slowly. We verified all the corporate and SEC filings. There is no mistake. I was struggling to believe it myself. My dad had never, not once, mentioned that he was the head of such a powerful private equity fund. And even more shockingly, that he had personally saved David's company. The CFO then flipped to other pages in the document. The first capital injection was for $2 million. He turned the page. 6 months later, another $1.5 million was added. Next page. Another $2 million. And on the final page, $2 million more. A grand total of $7.5 million. I took a deep breath. For the first time, I finally understood why David's company had grown at such a staggering, seemingly impossible rate over the last few years. There was a hidden hand keeping him afloat in the shadows. David was frozen in his leather chair. His face grew paler by the minute. Why? Why did I never know? The CFO answered cautiously. Because that was the investor's strict demand. He required absolute anonymity. All communications and wire transfers were handled through a shell matrix. I closed my eyes for a second. Memories of things that used to seem strange started flooding back. Every time David's company hit a roadblock, somehow, a massive development project would just fall from the sky. Every time cash flow was in danger, fresh funds magically cleared. All this time, I believed it was strictly the fruit of David's brilliant hustle. Now, the puzzle pieces fit perfectly. The CFO turned one more page. There is one more thing, David. David lifted his head at a glacial pace. What? There is a special morality clause in this contract. What clause? The The CFO took a deep breath before answering. The investor retains the right to immediately withdraw all funding and call in all debts if he determines that the receiving entity has violated the agreed-upon core values. Core values? The CFO nodded. Integrity, honesty, and family moral responsibility. I saw David's hands curl into tight fists. For the very first time, his face showed true remorse not for hitting Matthew, but because he had just realized that this entire apocalypse was directly tied to the argument from 2 days ago. With a hollow voice, he asked, "And if the investor exercises that right?" The CFO didn't use words to answer. He handed over a certified FedEx letter that had been delivered that very morning. David ripped it open. The document contained just a few brief, highly formal lines. The investing entity hereby provides official notice of the immediate and permanent suspension of all subsequent funding rounds. All linked credit lines are terminated. The company is required to liquidate and settle all financial obligations in accordance with the terms of the contract. There were no curse words, no wild threats. But the cold corporate reality of that letter was infinitely more terrifying than anyone screaming. I looked at David. He was still holding the paper with trembling hands. His lips moved in slow motion. "Are you sure this is your father's doing?" I didn't answer, because deep down in my heart, I already knew the truth. A few seconds later, the CFO spoke up again. "Actually, there is even worse news." David looked up with dead, empty eyes. "There's more?" The CFO swallowed hard. "If the primary investor officially withdraws all asset backing, according to the commercial lending laws, the bank has the right to demand the immediate, accelerated repayment of every single outstanding corporate loan." The room fell silent again, and in that exact moment, I saw true, raw fear in the eyes of a man who had spent his whole life believing he was invincible. From that day on, our house turned into a strange place. Not because the furniture had changed, but because the man living in it was no longer the same. David almost never came home before midnight, and when he did, he locked himself straight in his home office. His phone rang constantly. Sometimes he spoke in a begging, pleading tone, other times he screamed in pure rage, and sometimes he just sat in silence for a long time before hanging up without a word. I chose not to ask questions. I knew any answer coming out of his mouth would only be loaded with misplaced anger. 2 days later, the news officially broke, not on the local TV stations, but in the employees' group chats. One of the admin girls texted me, "Sarah, is it true the company is going under?" I read the text several times. Before I could reply, she sent a photo of the company's main entrance. Dozens of construction workers were crowded out on the sidewalk. Several supply trucks were parked out front, blocking the gates. No one was allowed inside. I could only stare at my phone screen in silence. That evening, David came home looking physically withered. He didn't even change out of his suit. The tie he always kept perfectly knotted hung loose and crooked around his neck. He opened the stainless steel fridge, stared into it for a few seconds, and then closed it without grabbing a thing. I set a glass of ice water on the kitchen island. "Drink some water." David sat down slowly. His hands betrayed sheer, absolute exhaustion. We sat in silence for a while. Then, he spoke in a low voice. "They shut down 4 of our active job sites today." I didn't interrupt. He kept talking to himself. "If we don't get a cash injection by next week, I'll have to file for mass furloughs and lay off all the crews." I remained quiet. Not out of a lack of empathy, but because I knew in that moment, David was only talking to his own ego. The next day, the situation escalated drastically. The COO came to our house holding a massive stack of folders. I overheard their conversation from the hallway. "David, the heavy equipment leasing company just showed up at the warehouses. They have a court order for repossession." "For what machinery?" "All of it. Every caterpillar, every crane that was leveraged as collateral." The room went quiet. Then came the harsh screech of a chair being shoved back violently. David had shot to his feet. "They can't do that. They have a judge's mandate, just like the contract stipulates." The COO sounded incredibly cautious. "They say the payment grace periods have officially expired." I watched David walk out to the back patio. He stood there for a long time, staring out into the empty backyard, trying to swallow a razor-sharp reality. 2 days passed, and more bad news arrived. This time, from the bank. It wasn't a simple late payment notice. It was official documentation stating that every single corporate credit account had been frozen solid. I watched David hold that letter for an eternity. He read it over and over, perhaps hoping the ink on the page would magically change, but no, it was over. That night, it rained heavily. As I was going to lock the front windows, I noticed a black sedan park right in front of our driveway. Several men in sharp suits stepped out holding clipboards. They identified themselves as bank-appointed appraisers. I was a bit confused until one of them politely said, "Ma'am, we are just following protocol. We are here to appraise and inventory all assets listed as collateral in the foreclosure filings." I watched the last drop of blood drain from David's face, leaving him as white as a sheet. He tried to argue with them, but the appraisers just strictly did their jobs. They took photos of our suburban estate, jotted down the VIN numbers of the luxury SUVs in the driveway, and documented every valuable asset. There was no screaming, no drama, and it was exactly that bureaucratic clinical coldness that made the whole ordeal feel so suffocating. The following morning, my mother-in-law, Barbara, rushed over. Her face was a mask of pure panic. "David, you have to fix this mess right now. What are the neighbors going to say if the bank forecloses on this house?" It was the first time I had ever heard my mother-in-law worry more about public embarrassment than her own son's well-being. She kept rambling. "If you need cash, sell the summer cabin at the lake. Sell the Porsches. The most important thing is that our family's name doesn't get dragged through the mud." David just kept his head down. There were no arrogant comebacks anymore. Hours later, my sister-in-law showed up. But she didn't come to offer emotional support. She came to grab the iPad that Hunter took everywhere. Her son had been whining because he was terrified the bank appraisers were going to repossess his tablet too. Without exchanging more than a few words, they bolted. I watched David from a distance as he stared at his sister's car disappearing down the street. The very people who used to show up daily to bask in the fruits of his success were now drawing hard boundaries. No one offered to help. No one told him they had his back. They came when there was a feast, and they scattered like roaches the second the bill arrived. Late that night, David sat alone in the dark living room. He hadn't turned on the lamps. The only light came from the streetlights filtering through the large windows. I was about to head up to bed when he suddenly called out to me. "Sarah." I stopped. "Do you think, if I go see your dad, I can still fix all this?" I stared at him for a long time. The question felt surreal. For years, David had been absolutely convinced he was the master of his own universe. Now, for the first time, he was placing all his hope on the very man he had publicly humiliated just a week ago. I didn't answer, because I didn't know if the door to forgiveness was still open. But deep down, I felt David had realized way too late who the person silently holding up his entire life really was. The next morning, David woke up much earlier than usual. For the first time in days, he put on a crisp white dress shirt, the kind he used to wear for his most vital board meetings. But this time, he wasn't carrying blueprints or project pitches. There was no leather briefcase or black car waiting for him outside. He just held a small manila folder. Before leaving the house, he stopped in front of Matthew's bedroom. The door was cracked open. Matthew was still dead asleep, hugging his favorite stuffed bear. David stood there for a very long time. Who knows what was going through his head in that moment? Then, he sighed softly and pulled the door shut without waking his son. "I'm stepping out for a bit," was all he said to me. I nodded without asking questions. I already knew exactly where he was going. My father's house sat at the end of a very quiet road out in the country, in the Hudson Valley. It wasn't flashy like the mansions the tech bros or real estate tycoons parade around in magazines. It was a traditional, rustic stone house, very humble. The front yard was bursting with hydrangeas and geraniums that my dad tended to himself. He had never cared for excessive luxury. When David arrived, the front gate was already open. My father was watering the flower beds with a garden hose. He saw David pull up, but he didn't stop what he was doing. There was no greeting. No smile. David walked up slowly. "Mr. Robert." My father kept watering the plants. The tension became unbearably thick. Seconds ticked by without a single word being spoken. Finally, David spoke again. "I came to ask for just a few minutes of your time, please." Only then did my father shut off the brass valve, dropping the hose next to a large clay pot. "You have 5 minutes." His voice was entirely flat. David nodded quickly. "That's enough." They sat across from each other on the stone porch. I had pulled up a few minutes behind him, worried the conversation would devolve into a screaming match. From a distance, I watched the backs of these two men, a father trying to protect his grandson, and another father who had just realized the magnitude of his own sins. David pulled out the manila folder. Mr. Robert, I know I've made a lot of mistakes. My father didn't reply. I also know you are deeply disappointed. Silence. I didn't come here to make excuses. I came to ask for a second chance. My father finally looked up. A second chance. Yes, a chance to fix things. My father studied David closely. Did you come here today as Matthew's father or as the owner of a bankrupt company? The question paralyzed David. A few seconds later, he answered in a whisper. I came as both. My father slowly shook his head. That is exactly your problem. You still don't get it. David looked at him in total confusion. My father continued. If your company was thriving and pulling in millions, would you be sitting on my porch today? There was no answer. If they hadn't shut down your high-rises in Miami, would you be here right now, crying about how you treated Matthew? David lowered his head again. My father exhaled slowly. You aren't sorry for the slap. You are sorry for the consequences that slap brought upon you. Those words completely shattered David's composure. I knew my dad had just said to his face what no one else had the courage to say. A moment later, David stood up. And then, very slowly, he dropped to his knees right on the hard stone porch. I froze in my tracks. In all our years of marriage, I had never seen David degrade himself like this. I'm begging you, Robert. Please give me one last chance. I'll fix it all. I will be a good father. I will apologize to Matthew 1,000 times. I will do whatever you ask. David's voice started cracking. If this company goes under, hundreds of construction workers are going to lose their ability to feed their families. My father listened without interrupting. When David finally stopped talking, my dad slowly stood up. He walked inside the house without uttering a single syllable. David stayed on his knees. His eyes tracked my father's footsteps until he vanished behind the heavy oak door. For a second, I actually thought maybe my dad's heart was softening, that maybe he was reconsidering the whole thing. A few minutes later, the door swung open again. My father stepped out holding a white cardboard box tied with a blue ribbon. It wasn't very big, roughly the size of a standard bakery box. He held it with both hands. David scrambled to his feet instantly. His face was flooded with a sudden rush of hope. He probably believed that box held the notarized contracts that would save his firm, or a cashier's check that would halt the foreclosures. My father walked up to David and placed the box right into his hands. Open it, please. With shaking hands, David untied the blue ribbon. As he slowly lifted the lid, his face turned to stone. His eyes stopped blinking. His entire body went rigid, unable to make a single sound. I was standing a few yards back, so I couldn't see what was inside the box yet. However, based on the absolute devastation on David's face, I knew whatever was in there was infinitely more painful than losing his entire net worth. With excruciating slowness, David pulled the contents out of the box. It wasn't a stack of legal documents. It wasn't a stack of promissory notes, nor a contract to pull him out of ruin. Inside, there was only a small, incredibly simple birthday cake. Stuck into the frosting were 7 unlit candles, and sitting next to the cake was a small brown envelope. My hands began to shake. I recognized that bakery box instantly. A few days before Matthew's birthday, my dad had called me in secret. He told me he had ordered a special cake for his grandson because he wanted to surprise him. But since he had to travel out of state for business, he had the bakery deliver it to his house first. I never could have imagined that very same cake would end up in David's hands today. My father stared at him, his expression utterly unwavering. 2 weeks before Matthew's birthday, I had everything ready. His voice possessed a devastating calmness. I also bought him the one gift he wanted more than anything in the world, a navy blue bicycle with a matching helmet. And I did it because my greatest joy in life is seeing my grandson laugh. David kept staring down at the cake. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. My father went on. But when I walked through your front door, the only thing I saw was the red print of your hand on his face. The porch fell into absolute, deafening silence. The morning breeze rustled the hydrangeas. Nobody spoke a word. I kept this cake on purpose. Not because I expected some miraculous change in you, but so that one day, you would realize just how damn cheap a child's happiness actually is. My dad pulled one of the candles out of the cake and held it right up to David's eyes. My grandson didn't ask you for a sports car. He didn't ask you for a mansion in the hills. He didn't ask for a trust fund. All he wanted was the chance to blow out 7 damn candles with his father. And you couldn't even give him that. David's tears finally spilled over. For the first time since the day I met him, he sobbed uncontrollably, making no effort to hide it. With a voice that was barely a thread, he managed to choke out, "I failed completely." My father nodded slowly. "You didn't fail the day your company went bankrupt, David. You failed the exact day your son lost hope in his own father." That final sentence was the kill shot. David buried his face in his hands and wept bitterly, but there was no turning back. Nothing could be undone. Several weeks later, the liquidation and foreclosure processes for the company's assets were finalized. The downtown office building changed hands. The heavy machinery was auctioned off. The luxurious suburban McMansion, which for so long had been the family's crown jewel, was sold at a sheriff's auction. The high-end cars that used to decorate the driveway were towed away one by the repo men. What surprised me the most wasn't the loss of material wealth, but seeing how all those people who used to swarm around David daily vanished into thin air like magic. My mother-in-law, Barbara, decided to move into her daughter's condo. She claimed that at her age she couldn't bear the humiliation and hardship. The nephew they had spoiled rotten never once came to visit him. Not a single person stayed when the money and the luxury evaporated. In the end, David was left completely and utterly alone. As for me, I finally made the decision I had been putting off for far too long. I filed for divorce. Not because David was broke, but because I absolutely refused to let Matthew grow up in an environment that made him feel utterly worthless. The legal process was quick and quiet. David didn't contest a single thing. He just sat in the attorney's office with his head down and signed the papers. Before we parted ways for good, he asked me for one single thing. "Can I have visitation rights? Just to see Matt every now and then?" I didn't answer right away. I looked down. Matthew was standing right beside me, holding my hand tightly. With his soft, sweet voice, it was Matthew who answered, "Yes, Dad. You can come see me. But only on the condition that you don't get mad anymore." That response, so painfully innocent, made David break down in tears all over again. He nodded over and over, completely unable to speak. But Matthew didn't run to hug him. My son simply waved goodbye to him with a polite, formal little wave and a tight smile. It was in that exact moment that I understood. The wounds in a child's heart can eventually heal, but things will never, ever go back to the way they were before. A few months later, my father invited us to spend Sunday at his house in the Hudson Valley. There, sitting right in the middle of the garden, waiting for us, was a brand new, navy blue bicycle. The very same one that, until now, had only existed in the story he told exactly as he had prepared it. Matthew's eyes went wide as saucers. "Is that for me?" My father gave him a warm smile overflowing with love. "You bet, champ. It's your birthday present." Matthew launched himself at his grandfather, hugging him with all his might. His crystal-clear laughter flooded the garden, a sound I hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. That day, we finally lit the 7 candles that hadn't been allowed to shine before. There was no massive party, no expensive catering, no flashy gifts. It was just the 3 of us. Yet, that atmosphere radiated far more warmth than all the wealth I had ever lived around. Right before Matthew blew out the candles, my dad leaned in and whispered to him, "Always remember this, buddy. A person's true worth is never measured by the expensive gifts they receive, but by the unconditional love they feel from the people around them." Matthew nodded, smiling with bright, shining eyes. He took a deep breath to tangs. I looked up at the orange sunset painting the country sky. For the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, completely free. And watching Matthew laughing hysterically as he pedaled his new bike across the grass, I finally understood it all. The best revenge isn't watching someone lose their fortune. It is making absolutely sure that the person they hurt ends up living a beautiful, happy life, feeling deeply loved and fulfilled. Meanwhile, the one who threw that happiness away will have to spend the rest of their days carrying a heavy, incurable regret, one that no amount of millions could ever buy away.